Well, hello there and welcome back to the podcast. My name's Levi.
I'm Jennie, and we're so happy to be here with you today.
That's right. We're your host, and this is it. Don't get scared now. Abandon all hope into here. I'm like, what?
It's better than it sounds.
Yeah, no. We're truly glad you're here. Today's conversation on Hey, it's the Luskos is a needed and an important conversation. Mm-hmm. It's all about grief. That's right. From the beginning, we want to tell you by the end of this conversation, if you can stick with us throughout this episode, we're going to try and get our arms around the process of grief. Now, hearing that, you might have a lot of different reactions. You might think to yourself, well, I don't need that. I'm not grieving right now. Well, buckle up, Buttercup, because you will be.
Yeah.
At some point in every one of our lives, we are going to have to face the difficult, messy, unpredictable terrain that is grief.
Yeah.
Grieving the loss of someone, something, a season in our life coming to a close, a difficult move, a painful divorce, someone we care about dying. And in that, we get then plunged into grief. And today, we have on the podcast someone who is literally an expert in grief, not only because he has studied both psychology and has a master's degree in divinity and has been involved in church work, but for the last almost decade has been serving in a level 1 trauma hospital in Florida as a chaplain, where he steps into the room with families and patients and tries to help do what he can to serve and be there with them as they go through the most difficult things imaginable. Yeah. And he wrote a book, which I had the chance to read. We talk a little bit about that in the conversation. That helped me a lot processing my dad going home to be with Jesus this year. And I immediately reached out. I was like, I want to have this guy on, have a conversation with him, because I've never read a book where I immediately was like, man, I want to give that guy a hug. He just is so kind. And this conversation was like that. It was like an hour and some change of him sharing helpful principles that were really very generous of him to give me, but I know for a fact are going to encourage everyone listening.
Definitely. I'm so excited for this conversation, and also just really excited about what God has for us in this moment, but also this summer, and what God's doing in our midst, all of us. I mean, everyone listening, but we have some opportunities to have some fun this summer if you want to join us.
We're taking our Bible study and worship lives and taking them onto a boat. And it's called the Incomparable Cruise. We are setting sail with Carrie Job and Cody Carnes and Lisa Harper. And we're going from Rome all the way to Athens. And we're exploring some of the events that took place in the book of Acts along the way. Yeah. I mean, Paul lost his life in Rome. There will be a chance if you take the extension add-on at the beginning to go and see where that took place and step into the Colosseum and see where he preached to Mars Hill, at Mars Hill in Athens, and all these different things that, like Ephesus, where Ephesians plays out. The longest Paul ever pastored was in Ephesus. And so to get to see that and experience that, I mean, Ephesus was pastored by Timothy. Ephesus, the church there, was pastored by John, the beloved, as well as Mary, because he promised to take care of Mary. So John and Mary both would have been in Ephesus at some point, which is crazy to think about, sitting next to Mary in church. Yeah. It's like, hey, tell me about Jesus as a little boy. I've got great stories, He's always partying his Kool-Aid. No, I'm kidding. But that's going to be really powerful.
And there's still time to sign up for that.
I think so. I mean, I don't know for a fact.
That's what this paper says.
Does it? Oh, it says there's still time. You're right, it does. So you can go to levilusko.com and click the Incomparable Cruise if you feel like going on a boat with me and Jennie to preach from Rome to Athens. If you don't feel like doing that, don't you dare click that link. But if only if you do, then we'd love to have you.
Yeah, we would. It's going to be amazing.
Yes, but let me say on the subject of grief, if there's someone in your life who's going through a hard time, facing a difficult loss, this would be maybe an episode to kind of send their way. Yeah. Maybe they aren't ready for a book yet. I mean, I know there's different styles of grieving, ways people grieve, but this could be helpful for someone.
Yeah. Well, this helped you very close to when your dad went to heaven.
The book helped me a lot. And then this conversation was great because I got to ask some questions that were on my mind. And it was a really, really special conversation.
Good.
So his name's J.S. Park. He wrote a book called As Long as You Need. And his nickname is June, or I don't know if it's his nickname. Maybe it's his real name is June. But I was saying your nickname is June.
Yeah.
But his is Joon.
Oh.
And yours is June.
Yeah.
So.
Because what you call me is Juniper, but short for Juniper is June.
Or Juniflower. Or Junie. Lots of different nicknames.
Yes.
Depends on the day of the week. Or if I'm stern, just Jennifer. Yes. All right. Well, please do enjoy this conversation with the author and hospital chaplain extraordinaire, J.S. Park. Well, J.S. Park, thank you for coming on the podcast. Welcome to Hey, It's the Luskos.
Levi, I'm happy, honored, humbled to be here. Thank you.
It is a neat thing how God brought us together, our paths knit. My friend, our mutual friend, you're friends with Deborah Fileta, right?
Deborah Fileta. Why is it? Oh, should I know her? Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry.
Okay, so, well, yes, you should, because she's amazing. You would love her. She is the one who mailed me your book. She sent it to me when my dad died at the beginning of April, and she's been a longtime friend and a counselor to my wife and I, and so she was the one who sent me your book. I assumed you guys were friends, but she must have just loved your book.
Yeah. Oh, well, thank you, Deborah, for sending it to you. Yeah, and I wanted to say, I wanted to honor and lift up your dad as well. I read, your 2 posts about him that week, and just, yeah, when the giants in our lives, go on into glory, it's a hard loss. It's a hard loss. So I just wanted to lift that up and honor his life.
Bro, thank you. Thank you so much for saying that. I got this book, and coming from Deborah, I knew it was going to be a good book. The book's called, by the way, As Long as You Need, and it is Permission to Grieve. And so I get this book in the mail, and it's a nice thing when someone in your life reaches out with a tool that they think will help you. And I sat down and I read it, and when I say I loved your book, that would be too small of praise. I love the content. I love your voice as an author. I love turns of phrases that you would write. I can tell you love words, and I could tell we were definitely simpatico in how we kind of put together phrases. It moved me. I actually joked with a couple friends that I'm so glad you hadn't written this book when I went to write my first book, because I might not have written my first book. Because my first book was written a decade ago about kind of grief and loss, and I similarly like poetic language and turns of phrases, and I'm being facetious, of course, because I wrote it out of a sense of calling, but your book was so good that had I read it, I for sure would have been influenced by it. So I'm grateful it didn't exist, because I might not have ever put in pen to page, because I would have been so blessed by the book that you wrote. But it has, I've since finished it, and every page that I enjoyed, I turned down a little corner of it in the bottom, and you can see this thing is just mutilated. I turned my siblings onto it, and so it really genuinely did help me a lot, grieving the loss of my dad, and is still continuing ideas from it to help me. So thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Levi. I know that when we're grieving, when someone hands us a book, that's not always like the ideal kind of way to cope and to go through that loss. So thank you for taking the time to read it. I know there are some folks who, when they're grieving, they try to read everything they can get their hands on. We all have our different responses to loss. I think I wrote, we grieve differently like we need differently. We all go through it in different ways. So thank you for that. And I'm sure what you wrote is fantastic. I'm glad that we're both fellow wordsmiths. I agonized over every word in the book, and you're also a great communicator, and I love everything that you have to say. So I'm going to make a mental note to pick up your book as well.
We are here on a bromance already. I like it. No, but to back up, because this conversation will be about grief, because that's what this is about. That's what I'm living in. for those listening, I know this is going to encourage you and bless you, but I would tell you also to pick up the book for someone in your life going through something hard, or for yourself as well, or just even to have a unique perspective kind of ready to go when hard times strike. But I wanted to start with this concept that you introduced that I'd never heard articulated, and that's intra-psychic grief. Intra-psychic grief. For those who, like me, have not heard or been familiar with that concept, could you unpack what that is?
Sure. Intra-psychic grief is the response that we have. It's the painful response we have when we lose something that can never be. And so much of loss, so much of grief, rightfully is about things that we have lost and grieving the past. So if we look at a timeline, here's everything that we lost, and the people that we lost, the dreams that we had can no longer go with us into the future. Intrapsychic grief on a timeline has to do with the future. And there's not even really a phrase for that. I've tried to find one in languages and cultures, but to say, I'm sorry for your future loss, it's a hard thing to wrap our minds around. But if you think about, even in the context of the death of a loved one, one of my fellow chaplains says, when someone dies, they take with them all the possible future that you could have shared with them. There's the loss of inside jokes. There's the loss of shared joy and sorrow. And then there's also the loss of future promise. I wish they would have seen my grandchildren, wish they could have been at my graduation, or see me got married, or see me accomplish this next big thing. And so I've heard some people call that secondary loss, but I don't think there's anything secondary about it. A death of a dream, a death of the future is just as tangible and visceral and real as the loss of a whole person. And so many of us, I think, experienced in 2020 in particular, there were necessities that we took in order to keep each other safe, and that also came at a cost. And that cost was many of our plans, our meeting together, just evaporated. And so most of us, all of us, I would say, were experiencing this collective, communal, global grief of losing the future. And it's hard to know what to do with that. How do we honor that? Because we can honor a person, we can honor past memories, but how do we honor the future? And it's author Kate Bowler. She's written some great books. She's written Everything Happens for a Reason and Other Lies I've Loved. Wow. It's a fantastic title already.
Yep.
But she was, I believe, a religion professor at Duke. And then I think she was diagnosed with stage 3 or stage 4 cancer. And she said that, and I'm paraphrasing, she said she thought the hardest thing about loss was losing all the things before, but it's actually about an eroded future, the future that is blank, that was supposed to come to pass. And what I found is that when I sit with patients who have lost autonomy due to some kind of critical injury or illness, or they're now living in chronic pain and illness, their biggest loss is about, I was on my way to do this. I have plans to do that. Here was this blueprint that I had for the future. And now they're not on plan B or plan C. They're on plan W or plan Q. They're on just some other timeline. And most people, I think, and rightfully so, will try to help them readjust to their new condition, their new situation. But as a chaplain, my hope is I might ask them, what were the plans that you had? What were your hopes? Can you tell me about what you were on your way to, or what you were doing, or what you had hoped to do? And so I try to give space and make room and to honor that timeline that they wish that they could have had. And I don't think there's anything unhealthy about it. There are people that may say, keep the past in the past, or now you got to move on and find a new way and turn the page and do, you got to figure this out. But I think we might rush past that too much. And if we do that, we can become, I think in the book, I say we become time sick. It just festers, these hopes and dreams and plans that we had. So I'll often ask, well, what do you think it would have been like if this and this? And just give my patient a chance to tell that story.
Yeah. You used the phrase, the loss of a memory unmade, which is, it puts language around what I experienced when my daughter died. So our daughter died at 5 in 2012 in kindergarten. And the next day, her and I were supposed to go on a daddy-daughter date Christmas shopping at Walmart. And then we were going to go on a family dinner and ice skating. And then their Christmas present, our kids' Christmas present, was going to be this trip to Disneyland. And the memory was unmade, but we had already begun to look forward to it. Yeah. We had already kind of like fantasized about ice skating. I'd already thought about how fun that dinner was going to be. I'd already picked out, what I was going to wear or whatever. So that memory was already precious, but it wasn't ours yet, but it was taken from us as a future, like you said. And that just realizing, okay, that feeling, because it felt cruel to be looking forward to something that you would never get to do. And it was never ours. So we weren't really mourning that we didn't get to do it, but that kind of helps me understand why that felt so painful, because we were mourning the loss of a memory unmade, right?
Yeah. I had read online about the loss of your child. I didn't want to bring it up unless you did.
I love talking about Linya. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So I did want to just pause and say I'm very sorry, and just to lift up her life.
Thank you.
And her life is certainly honored in yours. So just wanted to honor her for a moment.
Thank you.
Yeah. Would love to hear, Levi, if it's okay with you, if I may so ask, what kind of plans you had for that day for Christmas shopping.
She had been saving up money and wanted to buy her older sister a present. And so it was all excited about, using her own money to buy, that takes you right back. The week had been really busy with church stuff, ministry stuff, so much going on. And every night we had something: staff Christmas party, small group Christmas party. There was something every day that kept us busy. And in ministry, holidays are like your biggest time, right? I mean, you're always working holidays. So we've always tried to create, hey, there's going to be special family time built in. And all week long, we had talked about Friday Family Day coming, and never having a clue that she would die on Thursday. So there's no good time for someone to be lost, but it just felt particularly inconvenient that she died at the end of that busy stretch, so that we didn't get the weekend payoff of that. So that day was going to be kind of a makeup for that whole crazy week. And then, fancy dinner. I had reserved a restaurant with cloth napkins, and I've been talking to them about that. We're going to go to this fancy restaurant we'd never been to before. And for a long time, it actually horrified me, that restaurant. I couldn't go there. But eventually, we overcame that and did, on one of the anniversaries of her going to heaven, a big day there. And it was kind of a big overcoming, of a loss, and taking back of territory that, we didn't want to haunt us. But yeah, the one-on-one time with her, I was looking forward to so much. And then, of course, the trip to Disneyland. But again, it felt so mean to have someone pry into my memory box, something I'd never even got to actually, live out, right?
Yeah. Can you tell me your name again?
Linya.
Linya.
Linya, yeah.
Beautiful name. Well, what an amazing spirit that she had to save up for her sister. And, in many ways, I think that reflects what was instilled in her from your family. So, yeah, to Christmas shopping, to cloth napkins.
There we go.
To Linya. I'm real sorry that was taken from you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
I can't even imagine.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's funny, the way that new grief makes old grief fresh again, because I think walking through this, and the reason I was so receptive to, what they say, when the student is ready, the teacher will appear. It was perfect timing for you to come in, with your clinical knowledge of grief and your tender spirit too. It's clear for those who don't understand your background. You've worked a decade in trauma hospitals, right?
Yeah,
as a chaplain?
Almost 9 years now. Yeah.
Gosh. So you step in every day to report for duty, and you're walking into fresh shock, trauma, grief, loss, death, and then walking patients and their families, through those really hard moments.
Yeah. I'm thankful right now I work medium time, but gosh, you know how it is with pastoral care and ministry. There's no such thing as part-time or medium time, Yeah. But yes, it feels like it is around the clock. I work at a level 1 trauma center. And so seeing people in the worst day of their lives very often, and I've sat with hundreds, if not thousands, of deathbeds, critically ill and injured. And I remember every one of them, it's I dream about them all the time. But yeah, it's a lot of loss. And, how it is with calling. I can't imagine being anywhere else. I think it's where I belong and where I want to be.
Wow. How did you sense that? Because from what I understand, you've been writing books for a long time, but you've also at various points been involved in pastoral ministry within the church as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I was, I grew up an atheist, and then I found really this church found me. They asked me if I could play drums for their praise team because they found out I could play drums. It's a small little church.
And we're always looking for drummers in church. That's perennial need. Yeah.
Yeah. So, you've heard the joke before where, what do you call a drummer? He's a guy who hangs out with musicians.
Right.
So I said, I asked them, is it a problem that I'm an atheist? And they said, no, just come on over and play with us.
But can you keep time? That's the real question.
Right. Yeah.
As long as you're on beat,
Yeah. Can you play in the key of G? Like, yes, I can. So I got there, and, the pastor there, English was not his first language. And the sermons, his preaching anyway, wasn't the best, but somehow just the love of this church. It wasn't any apologetic or academic persuasion. There was no argument. Just this church kept loving me. And this was around college. And I just kind of traced back to the source, like extrapolated backwards. There's got to be a source to all of this. There's a reason for all of this. There's supernatural love. And then somehow found myself in seminary, and then decided, I had majored in psych. I thought I was going to be a therapist, but then went to the pastoral ministry route, pastoral care. And so I thought I could do ministry. And so I did youth and college ministry for about, I want to say, almost 7 years, 5 years in one church and 2 years at another, almost 2 years at another. And what I discovered quickly was, I grew up an atheist, so I didn't really know what church was about or what church was like. My dad had tried to take me when I was a kid, but I didn't know much about it. When I finally got to that place, I felt like I was outsider looking in, just always on the outside of glass, seeing into the church, and just felt like an oddball. I wasn't smart and savvy enough for the backroom, boardroom politics of it all and raising funds. And it takes a very special kind of person to lead ministry and to be a pastor. And shout out to every pastor still doing it. So much perseverance. And like you were talking about that busy stretch of the week you had, I don't know that I was built for that, And so my hat's off to you. You got to be built different for pastoral ministry.
A glutton for punishment is what it is. But it is a real honor. And it just is like, I look at what you do walking into with awe. I think we all kind of look at each other's callings and go, I could never do that. But it's like, well, you weren't called to. So with the calling comes the grace, right?
Yeah. And I try to make it fit, the whole like square peg and round hole type thing. And I just don't think it was working. And my youth students were the best part about it. They made it easy for me. But I think it was just some of the church stuff that I didn't know how to do. So during that time, I volunteered at this prison ministry for a few weeks. And then I was also at a ministry for the unhoused, for the homeless. During that whole time, I went once a week to volunteer. And every time I was there at that homeless ministry, or when I was there for that prison ministry for a few weeks, I just felt at home there. And then I heard about chaplaincy, which is like a pastor, but outside of the church. So for the military.
Yeah, let me stop right here and say, you say about being a chaplain.
Yeah.
You say, and I love this so much, you said, I'm a grief midwife or a grief doula. I'm kind of a pastor, but not really, kind of a counselor, but not totally. I'm somewhere between medicine and ministry. I just thought that was such a great encapsulation of the job of a chaplain.
Yeah, the joke that I make is I'm a cross between a priest and a therapist, or a therapriest. Yeah. And so I actually was at a really great church, the second one, and I resigned. I just felt called not to do it anymore. And I resigned about 4 months before I got married. So I got married without a stable job. And
Always a good move.
especially with my in-laws. Yeah. And, my wife being Korean, just they were all panicking. And I think rightfully so. But I ended up finding chaplaincy at this teaching hospital that I'm still at. And I remember my first clinical, I was in a room, I was shadowing a chaplain, and we broke the news to a family. We accompanied a physician. We told this family that their loved one had just died in the ER, did not make it. And this family, of course, was so upset, wailing, distress, extreme emotional expression, of course. And I followed this chaplain's lead in offering them comfort. And what I noticed is that the chaplain didn't even say that much, didn't have to, because in those moments, the silence, the presence is what we need, and the few words that we give have a very specific weight, so we choose them carefully. But when I was in that room, as hard as it was, just seeing the pain bounce off the walls, you get those moments in life where your calling, your story, your gifting, even the pain and trauma that you experience all come and click together. And you realize the experiences you had in life, even the pain, were lighthouses to lead you where you are. And that's what I knew. This is where I belong. This is what I am meant to do. And almost 9 years later, it's like, as hard as it is, I love this work even more than the first day, And, I grew up with so much trauma. I talk about this, I think, in chapter 4. I grew up in a very turbulent and violent and unpredictable household. And what I really needed was presence. What I really needed was reliability and consistency, just someone to be there. And I know that's something that's easy to say and just rolls off the tongue, be present, be available. But what a difference that makes, what a tangible, real difference it makes. And so I'm hoping that I can be the presence that I needed when I was younger. And there is something certainly where that can be dangerous, where I'm using this work to heal myself. I don't want that. That's an unhealthy way. But there is a healthy type of healing that happens when we end up in a place where we can say, I'm going to break these cycles and I'm going to pass on to the next generation, to the people around me, what I didn't get to have. And that's what I get to do.
Wow. Yeah, that's powerful. The lighthouses is a great analogy that brought you to where you are. You speak about cumulative grief in the book, and you talk about how, especially in your first few years, you mentioned it lovingly a moment ago, your patients and family showing up in your dreams, but it wasn't at the beginning so loving. It was more torture that you were carrying that loss, internalizing that loss, bringing all of their multiplied losses home with you. And it was kind of getting to a breaking point, right?
Yeah. So, I talk about, I think in chapter 2, I did end up losing my faith about 7 months into my chaplain residency. So I had the 6-month internship, 7 months. So it was a little over a year when it became too much and I reached a breaking point. And a lot of it was the cumulative grief, the trauma that I was vicariously taking in. I don't think my issue was so much that there is pain in the world. It was the degree and severity and extent of the suffering that I was seeing. You used the word earlier, unfair, and I think you said cruel, the cruelty of it,
Yeah.
And I went from atheism to faith, but then I started to revert back, and it was almost like I see the doctors and nurses and machines doing something, but God, what are you doing? I saw so many unanswered prayers, and they say tragedy comes in threes. I've seen tragedy come in 33s.
Wow,
It's just,
geez.
it's like one thing after another. And why are babies born to die? And why do we do organ transplant only for it to fail immediately, things like this, where I just saw the unfairness of it. And I started to think again, atheism being like this old familiar coat, the haphazardness and just the chaotic, almost meaningless senseless like randomness of the universe. I started to feel that feeling of nothing makes sense and there's no cosmic order, And so for a whole season, I just went back to that, where I thought there's no purpose, there's no intentionality. And if God were abusive, maybe that would make more sense. But I thought God was neglectful, that God didn't care at all. I think I say something like, I tried to look into the face of God and I was just met with stone and glass, just a callousness. And, I did come back around to faith, but I came back different. And to be truthful, I think I've lost my faith more than once. But every time I come back around, and I come back different. And I think where I've ended up now is I don't want faith something that I need to prove or hold up, that I have to hold myself, because that's when it's a burden. But anything that holds me, instead of being a burden, anything that bears me up.
Yes.
That's what I hold on to.
You tell a story about going into one of your, I don't know if it was your supervisor or someone's office kind of with that, and they gave you a mental model that I thought was so helpful about the sides of the box being blown out. And that's the sort of what is commonly called deconstruction. The box of your theological understanding of who God is got blown out. And a lot of people leave it there, but you talk about how it's done so that a new, bigger box can be drawn, right? Yeah.
I guess I deconstructed before it was cool, but
you were just ahead of your time.
Yeah, I don't know if it was deconstruction so much as just destruction,
But the structure of your rigid theological box of what you thought God should do and how it should be.
Yeah, what gave way is something that had to go, because I had shallow, kind of sugary scaffolding ideas about what faith is. And so the theology that I had was just it was just Swiss cheese. It wasn't working. And so, my supervisor, shout out to Jennie, amazing chaplain supervisor. She did draw a box for me and said, every chaplain enters like this, with this box of what they think God is and what they think their faith is. And at some point within the chaplain training and within your job as a chaplain, she said, the box gets blown wide open. And then she drew a new box, and it was just like this funny trapezoid looking thing. And she says, you're eventually going to draw a new box, and it's going to keep happening. And, I was scared, but at least she pre-framed and prepared me so that it wasn't such a surprise. I wasn't so blindsided as it was happening. But one of our supervisors, Wayne, he's since moved on. He taught this training for us. We had didactics once a week in our chaplain training. He gave a didactic about when you embrace faith, first your theology interprets your experience. But after a while, when you go through suffering, when you talk with more people, as you have more things happen in your life, as you do more in your life, eventually your experience starts to interpret your theology more. And then it becomes this exchange where your theology interprets experience interprets your theology. And so I would hope that the theology that we have can interpret our experience in a way that is expansive and not constricting. And the experiences that we have, I think there is something that we can hold on to, that as we have these experiences that shake us, like I was shaken, that we can fall back on something that will hold us up through it. And so for me, I still find it so hard to believe, but I've also resolved on knowing that I think it's harder not to. And so at the end of the day, I just trust in cosmic constancy. I just trust that the center of the universe is God's love and grace, and that God's grace can get us through grief, and does. And it doesn't fix it necessarily. I don't think it solves it. There will be unanswered prayers. But every time I'm in a room where I see hands held, I no longer have expectations of a specific outcome or a result. But instead, my expectation is I just need hands held with the one that I love. And that's how I see God. That's how I see faith. just a hand holding in the midst of the wilderness.
Well, I mean, you think about, you use the phrase pocket theology, and I think, the glibness of Romans 8:28 or Jeremiah 29:11, or, those things just don't, those aren't a net to fall into in the pit of grief. The sense of a trite, it's all going to be okay. It's like, those sorts of God is good, God's for us, they don't have enough rebar and concrete to hold you up in a storm. I think just meaning when they're used glibly. And I think you're saying a theological framework you have to hold up, but to be held up by it instead, there's a tension to it, because my experiences, and I didn't, when Linya went to heaven, for us, it was not a, where was God and all of that, and why didn't he answer our prayers? I think I found in the cross and in the willingness of God to sacrifice his son for my daughter, and knowing he held her even then, my anger wasn't at him. There wasn't a sense of, why didn't you come through? And I prayed. It was more just coping with the fact that even though I know she's in heaven and I know I'm going to see her again because of the resurrection, there's still a sorrow in it. There's still an anguish in it. And I guess John 11 and Jesus weeping at the grave of a friend he's about to raise from the dead gave us great comfort that there's still space for sorrow, even when theologically in your head what the outcome of this is. There's still space for pain. There's still space for the raw, messy, steaming emotion of this is just still hard.
Yeah, I think truth delivered early is always going to be too bright and will burn.
Ooh, that's great.
I just think there's a time for truth. And like you said, we may cognitively know all the right theology, but when it's given at a time when it's still raw and fresh, it's going to hurt more than it helps. And I think we know that. And there's such a balance, there's a dance between holding that theology and that truth holding us up, but also for it to be delivered or remembered at a time when it's right. But you mentioned John 11:35, that very short verse. The brevity of it and the depth of it, it's exponentially proportionate, just how short it is, but how deep it is. And, Jesus, when he wept, we all know the story of it. It's Mary and Martha. And when we see that in the pages of scripture, he said something very different to Martha than what he did with Mary. With Martha, he almost gave like a mini sermon, like, I'm the truth and the life, I'm the resurrection. Do you believe you'll see Lazarus again? But with Mary, just wept. And he knew exactly what they needed. They needed different things. We learned that Martha earlier was like very organized and kind of was like an administrator and had to have things in order in the house, whereas Mary was sitting at the feet of Jesus. And so I love that Jesus did that differently. And I think timing is important. We know the ones that we love. How do we attune ourselves to those who are experiencing loss and making sure that we don't rush that process? I think sometimes what we do is, and this is out of positive intent, we say something into the silence of loss that we think is helping someone who's hurting, because it hurts to see someone hurt. And we each have an impulse out of compassion to want to fix or solve or heal. But inadvertently, those things will hurt that person because it's too soon. And what ends up happening is we're trying to pull this eschatological curtain of hope and insert future hope in the present loss. And we see that Jesus didn't do that. Jesus just wept with Mary. Certainly there are people like Martha who need the theology now.
And he knew, he was attuned and empathic enough to know what she wanted and needed in that moment. Yeah,
exactly. And I'm thinking also of 1 Kings 19, when Elijah sat under the broom tree and said, I'm no better than my ancestors, take my life. He wanted to die. And, he was being chased. It was literally hit on his life. And what I love about that is God did not give a lecture or lesson or an epiphany, didn't give a blueprint, but just sent an angel. And the angel did several really, really cool things, touched Elijah, that physical comfort, gave him bread and soup and water, and it says Elijah ate and then he went back to sleep. How many of us in our pain ate and just went back to sleep? That's what he needed.
Very good.
Yeah. And then he
It's
woke
a
up.
DoorDash gift certificate and a massage appointment. Yeah, right.
There it is. Yeah. 5:00 p.m. Let me bring food to your door. I won't even ring the doorbell. Let me just drop it off, And then when he got up, the angel said, get up. This journey is too much for you. And the implication is it's too much for you alone. I'm going to be with you. And I love that the way that God so gently and carefully approached Elijah, it was a very holistic, multi-dimensional way of caring for Elijah. Because we're heart, soul, mind, and strength. It wasn't just the mind. It wasn't just theology. He touched Elijah's body, provided for him physically, gave him food, made space for him to nap, and then said, I'm going to be with you. There was a relational comfort there. And so I think there is something about our compassionate impulse to want to say some magical combination of words that will solve someone's grief, and that comes out of good intent. But I always have to self-monitor, and I have to check myself. Oh, I want to fix. Let me just hang back a little bit and be okay with the stillness and silence of this and allow just my presence to be enough.
I love the story in the book about the pastor who was stepping on your toes, where you were just trying to get this girl to be honest that she was scared about her surgery and these things, but he was kept shooting daggers at you because he wanted just, hey, everything's going to be fine. Everything's, just the glibness of his response versus the space that you were giving her just to be human for a minute, and just that tension.
Yeah, so I had to change a lot of details to protect
I'm
privacy,
sure you did.
Of course, of my patients.
Witness protection service, yes.
Sure, yeah. There's HIPAA confidentiality. I wanted to be very careful about all of that. That story about that pastor is actually worse than what I described in the book. So I won't give it away. But it's a little bit of a running joke in the chaplain department that when we see a pastor in the room, it almost feels like a Wild West standoff, where they see the chaplain and it's almost like we're encroaching upon their territory.
Interesting.
And I get it, because pastors, have a connection with their parishioners, with their congregates. And I don't ever want to intrude upon that or invade upon their process. And I want and when they see us, they see the badge. Sometimes chaplains are seen as bad news, or we're seen as loose theology, ecumenical interfaith. Well, I don't know what faith you are. You're just
sure. You got the crescent moon next to the Jewish star, next to the cross, next to the right.
Sure, and I am an interfaith chaplain. I'll see anyone and everyone, while I have what I believe here. But I think there are some pastors who maybe feel threatened by it, or feel like we don't need you here. And I'll always leave if I'm not welcome. But in that one instance that I talk about in the book, it became this weird sparring match, where the patient welcomed me, but this pastor was not welcoming at all, and I had to navigate that. He was
physically edging you out during the prayer.
Yeah. And, it was even worse than that. And what I was trying to understand was, and trying to have empathy for, was this pastor, I think, was just scared, because when you have that sort of theology of, God always answers prayers if you pray enough, if you have enough faith, those kind of things, and you want your congregation to believe the same thing, and you're imparting that information. And when they're scared, it almost reflects, like the pastor may have thought, this reflects poorly on my preaching, if my pastor or if my parishioner doesn't act a certain way. I get all of that. But I do want to give a shout out to pastors too, who I do see consistent, reliable pastors who come in and will visit their congregants, and who are so loving and kind and offer comfort. And I also want to say, we are no enemies of pastors. It's a weird thing that happens in the room, but in the end, it's not about me, and it's not, it's not about what I want, but what my patient wants. I'm always going to advocate for them. But certainly in that book, y'all can read it. It was a wild experience. I almost couldn't believe it was happening as it was happening.
Yeah.
And so, I just want to have empathy, though, that I do try to understand what that pastor was thinking.
But it's sweet, though, because you come around where you're trying to come up in your head with a way that you could empathize with him and give him space to, be human with you. And he just didn't take that chance. He sped off towards the elevator and was out of there. But I laughed because I've been that pastor. I mean, it's hard. In fact, my very first summer of doing pastoral internship, I was the on-call pastor for going to do hospital visits. It was just anybody in our church that would call and request. It was a large church, and I was fresh out of Bible college and summer in between semesters. And the very first time I was sent, I did not feel well-equipped. I did not feel well-prepared. I mean, I guess some of it's trial by fire. You're never ready. But to walk into a room, a woman had a stillborn, had a baby die in the womb, and was in between that and the stillbirth. And so to be there and try and offer words of comfort. And I remember, trying to, in my head, tell myself, listen more than you speak. Just be present. They want just someone to sit there with them, not answers, right? Who has answers for such things? But just to sit and listen. And I asked if there was any passage of scripture I could read to them, and we had a sweet time, and there was a lot of tears. But man, I got in the elevator and the door shut, and I remember falling to the ground, bawling, just like I was not enough. But then later I realized, like, it wasn't about me. It was about what God was doing with the moment. And obviously, I think about that a lot, because it was in many ways emblematic of all the ministry I've ever done, where I wasn't ready. I don't have what it takes, but it wasn't about that. It was Christ in me working in that moment and being present, and seeing their suffering and sitting with them in it, and not being able or trying to fix anything, right?
Yeah. I'd love to pause to honor that patient and her family. What a loss that is.
And it was so insulting too, because later on I walked with them through the whole process, the funeral, everything, and they wouldn't let them bury that baby in a normal cemetery. For whatever reason, a stillborn child can't be buried in a human cemetery, so they made them bury the child in a pet cemetery. And to walk with them through that was just so, it was an honor to be with them and advocate for them and encourage them and at the service and all the things. And, they didn't let them have the baby in a hearse because it was so, I don't know the rules on all that, but they put the tiny little casket in the trunk of the limo the family was in. And that was such an educational experience on ways that little things can make an already unbearable experience worse.
Yeah.
And I didn't know that was coming for us, because, when Linya died, the cemetery was full, and then we tried to pick a second cemetery, and the church wouldn't let us because we weren't of that faith. And then they couldn't get the child-sized casket in time. So they were talking at one point about burying her in an adult casket. So it's like walking that family through it, I didn't have any idea at the time, was in some ways education for me on how it can be actually not even the main thing. It can be the secondary and tertiary things that are actually making this more awful than it needs to be, right?
Yeah. I'm so sorry to hear that. When my wife and we suffered a miscarriage last Easter, I think it costs more to have a miscarriage than to give birth.
Oh my gosh.
I think our debt was $26,000 plus. And just, it's grief upon grief. How unfair is that? But in reference to when you were saying about what God is doing in the room and what we don't know is happening, I've shared the story before, but real quickly, I did go to visit a patient and their family who the patient had a code blue. They had lost their heart rate. That's when resuscitation happens. And I remember sitting there for 3 hours with this family. We did like a prayer circle, but most of the time I was just sitting there, and I felt like a bump on the log. And, you were talking about how you felt maybe not up to the task or inadequate or something like that. You said something similar to that. I felt very much the same. Like, what am I doing here? Sometimes at the end of a shift, I'll look at another chaplain and be like, what did we even do today? What a weird thing we do. So I was just sitting there with this family for 3 hours thinking, not doing anything, but they didn't really want me to leave. They just needed another person there. So around the 3 hour mark, things were winding down. I went and I got this gift basket a few days later. And in the gift basket was this card And in the card they had written, "Thank you for everything." And what I didn't understand was I thought I did nothing, but I guess I was doing something, and to them it meant everything.
Yes, because you
And,
tied yourself around them, right? You use that language.
yeah,
You didn't tie a bow on their suffering. You tied yourself around them, and I love that mental model. If you'll get that in this book as long as you need. The idea that when you come into a room like that, your goal isn't to tie a bow, but to tie yourself into this moment in love, right?
yeah. And the punchline to that is, in the basket there was just one gift. It was just bags and bags of peanuts, and I'm allergic to peanuts.
Stop. They did not.
So,
Or maybe you did a terrible job, and that was their way of like revenge. Maybe they knew.
Yeah, maybe with quotes around "Thank you for everything."
This is sort of a voodoo doll.
Oh my goodness, yeah. It's God's sense of humor.
That's really funny, bro.
Yeah, sometimes we plant seeds and we don't see the fruit at the other end, right?
So you're the one on the airplane that they don't serve peanuts because of the death allergy. It's because June's on the plane.
It's completely my fault. Yeah. I'll be the lightning rod for that.
Funny. Oh my gosh. Wow. Hey, did you name your child? You said you lost that baby last year.
We didn't name her. I think we were at, I want to say, around 12 weeks. We didn't get to name her. So, that was a weird time, because when my wife got pregnant, I felt for the whole 12 weeks something was wrong. I know that sounds kind of, I don't tend to think, I'm very skeptical when it comes to those kind of things.
Sure.
But I just had that gut feeling like there's something off about this. I just knew something wasn't right. Then come to find out that was not viable. But we did not get to name her. I have seen in the hospital, I've been at bedside for what we call FTIU, fetal demise in utero, or stillbirth as well. And I've seen a lot of times where there's a naming ceremony, or they have the name picked out. So we honor that and do a prayer.
Well, I'm sorry for you guys' loss, and that I feel like is such an under-recognized grief in our country. Like, I feel like people almost feel bad for grieving that loss. I'm sure that's maybe lines up with your experience. I feel like there's almost, as we've shared our story around the country, and we'll meet people at moments, it almost like you almost feel such a sense of relief when people feel permission that's a real loss. You know what I mean? That's not, and maybe in some ways abortion has played into us having less, of a sense of loss over that. But, and I don't know all of the implications of that, but I know that, that's a real loss. I know that is so painful to carry and walk through.
Yeah. There are a lot of layered losses that are also not socially recognized or validated even. There's a type of grief called disenfranchised grief that covers losses that are not normally recognized. So even death of a pet, some people don't see that as anything meaningful, but pets are family too. There's a complicated disenfranchised grief called when an ex-spouse dies. There's still grief there. Or when an addict in the family dies, there's like multiple feelings of like guilt and maybe a little bit of relief, like they're not in pain anymore, and there's also grief over like if someone was an abuser in the family, like it's a relief that they're gone, but also all those dreams that we could have had about what that person should have been and could have been. So I think infant loss, in particular, like in utero, when there's a miscarriage, that's a disenfranchised grief that's not often talked about. We got phrases from people, things like, well, you can always make another one. Or,
oh God, how insensitive.
You already got one, or, oh, well, heaven needed another angel, those kinds of things.
Those are very helpful. Those are very helpful phrases.
Yeah. Yes. It's hashtag thinks I'm cured,
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's that disenfranchised grief that isn't, it's very complicated, many layers. It's like lasagna, and we don't know how to feel about it, but I think that could be a whole book on its own about losses. That one of the other disenfranchised griefs is like, when I saw hate crimes against the Asian community, when we see faces that look like ours, there's something called linked fate, where when I see someone in my community hurting, I may have never met them, I don't know them, but I still hurt when I see my own homeland, Korea, when there's stuff that happens there, violence or things like that, or, North and South Korea, especially the pain of that division, I feel it in my body.
Sure.
Yeah. And so that disenfranchised grief is not something we talk about much, but I hope we highlight that it is just as real of a loss as any other loss.
And you have permission, like that it doesn't have to sound painful to someone else to hurt to you. And it doesn't matter if theoretically another's grief is bigger or larger or smaller. Because I think one of the things we try and do is rank pain. And like I've had people come up and say, this is nothing like what you've gone through. I've never lost a child, so I can't. And I'm just like, I always want to stop and go, it doesn't matter. If your aunt died and that hurts, that hurts. Like if I lost a finger and someone else lost an arm, it's like, technically, is that loss bigger? Maybe, but if I've never lost a finger before, that's going to hurt me. So I think it's just almost like having the willingness to go, hey, I don't need to feel bad that I feel bad. It's still, like you said, even if it's not often recognized, the disenfranchised grief is a real grief too.
Yeah, I think you may be referring to comparative suffering, which is a phenomenon that occurs when we, rank pain, like you very perfectly said. I years ago now spoke to a group of Korean American students at Yale, and it was at this retreat center where they wanted me to speak on grief. I guess I'm the grief guy. And what I immediately came out of the gate with was, you may think because you're at Yale, because you have privilege, because your parents were resourced enough to be able to send you here, that your pain doesn't count. You may think because you're so blessed, because you come from a well-off background, that your pain is not as meaningful as someone across the world. I want you to know that, yes, you do have resources. Yes, you do have privilege. Yes, you do have maybe come from a very well-off family, but your pain still matters. You're still hurting when you're depressed, when you have anxiety, when your test is coming up. Yes, you may be going on to be a doctor, or you may be going on to have this really well-educated, well-resourced career, but your pain still matters, and we can't compare ourselves to somebody who is hurting and starving across the country. Can we do something for them? Yes. Can we recognize that pain, that it is in some ways deeper and harder? Yes. But I think for those students, they almost felt like they couldn't own their own hurt because they were very involved in a lot of these things happening around the world. And so I wanted to let them know that their privilege or their status or their resources doesn't disqualify them or exclude them from being able to grieve their own very real losses.
Wow. Okay, let's talk about the title for a minute, as long as you need, and day 366. That was very, very, very insightful, and I thought so powerfully articulated that basically, by definition, if your grief goes on even one day past 365 days, as an adult, or half that if you're a child, you're technically, clinically in an abnormal function of grief as per definition. Is that right?
Yes. So according to the DSM-5, it's in version 2 now. That's like the psychology handbook. It has the official diagnoses, I think, according to APA, American Psychiatry Association. So there's like a definition that is relatively new. It's prolonged grief disorder. And what it says is, after 1 year, if your grief is still causing debilitation, extreme emotion, then you have this disorder. And for anyone under 18, it's half a year, so 6 months. So apparently on day 366, you are now clinically diagnosed with the disorder. So I have two thoughts about it. I think one is, my optimistic take is, we do need to know when to intervene for someone who is not able to functionally reintegrate back into livelihood.
Right.
Yeah, there is a time, I think, when clinicians, mental health providers, healthcare providers can get involved and say, hey, at this point, there's failure. They call it failure to thrive. There's different names for it, but basically, you're not taking care of yourself. Your hygiene is actually life-threatening. That's all true. And I think that does cover that little bit of the population that's going to experience that. But what I'm worried about is, with diagnoses like these, it ends up going into pop culture, into wider society, into church culture, and into theology. It pathologizes our definitions of grief. It can get carried away to where culture hears a definition like that, and without reading into the caveats and into the very specific kind of criteria, they can run with that and say, hey, after a year, if you're grieving, you got a problem, And if you're a minor, it's 6 months. Why aren't you over this yet? Why are you still hurting? So exactly on the anniversary of that loss that you have, if you're still hurting, you need to get a certain kind of help. Something is wrong with you. And I think that does huge disservice to everyone grieving. And I think it's unfair that prolonged grief disorder is so specific in its number and its amount, to wrap a number around that, what a cruelty that is. So yeah, I do understand that there are people where there's an unhealthy way of grieving where it can become physically harmful to them. Certainly there's intervention, there are cases like that. But I do think in general, for the rest of us, which is most of us, that grief doesn't have a timeline. There are good days and bad days. And we've seen that illustration of grief where it's like waves. It can come and go. And some days it can still just be as strong as day one. Does that mean something is wrong with you? I don't think there is anything wrong with you that isn't quote unquote wrong with everyone else, that we're human and that it hurts and that loss was meaningful. And so for anyone listening, watching, who's feeling that loss and saying, why am I not over it yet? I would instead ask, in what way can we continue to honor that loss in our lives and integrate and incorporate that person, those dreams into our lives and to lift it up? And if we still feel it as strong as day one in year 10, I think that's part of being human.
You say in the book, speeding through grief always has a cost. And thus the title, when someone would say to you, how long is this going to take? You would say, as long as you need. There's not a formula. You can't rush this. You can't guarantee it. Results aren't going to be typical. My wife and I had very different processes when we grieved Linya. Our grief journey didn't exactly line up. And then even for me, I've been like, part of me was when my dad died, I, in the back of my mind sort of thought, having been through substantial grief in my life, I might be better at it. And it was shocking, surprising, and a little bit infuriating to me. Like, oh gosh, why? But then, the epiphany and the light bulb, of course, was this isn't the same grief. It's a completely, you've never grieved the loss of your dad before. It's a totally different animal. And there are some parts of me maybe that are better at least saying to myself like the right things to say to encourage myself through it, having been seasoned by trial. But it's its own thing, and I can't even compare what my journey has and will be like to what that one's like, because it's different every time for every person, right?
Absolutely. I mean, we can get better at grief literacy, like having the tools, the skill set, the capacity, but for a lifetime, we're going to remain amateurs at grieving.
It's so discouraging.
every loss is a fresh loss. And you know what? Even good change involves loss. I've talked with people who, when they get a promotion, they no longer can kind of hang out with the bros like they used to. We were all here working together on the floor, and now moving up to management, it's like, we don't have the same camaraderie, new responsibilities, moving to a new city with excitement, but also leaving the old one. Or expanding our ministry, those kinds of things. Even good change involves loss. And I think every time loss happens, it's like a whole new road with unmapped territory. And we can maybe get better at traveling through it. We can get maybe more literate at the grief itself and realize I don't need to suppress this or deny it. I can speak the story. I can process this out loud.
You call it looking loss in the eye?
Yep. Yeah, exactly. Without turning away, without avoiding it. But certainly, even with that grief literacy, even with the language around it, it's still just as hard, it's still just as difficult. We may know by memory how to change a tire, but when you're changing that tire on the side of the road and the cars are whizzing by, no matter how many times you do it, it's still pretty rough, out in the heat there on your knees, changing that tire. It's the same kind of thing where we may know what it's like. And I hope we don't shame ourselves for it when we feel like, gosh, I thought I would be better at this by now. But instead being able to say, this loss, just like every loss, is new and it's different. And what I need in this season might be different than the last.
I have found journaling, of course, that's kind of a known way to process emotions. Walks, being in nature, being off my phone, being honest with loved ones, and that sort of thing. But what perhaps in your experience would be pretty well, everyone's going to kind of have go-to things, right? Church and scripture and books like yours. Those would be kind of known. You mentioned in the book moving a bead into a jar for a patient as a way at the end of a shift for, that's something maybe someone wouldn't think of. Is there other things like that either you've seen other chaplains do or maybe patients do that are a little unorthodox that would be helpful for someone in a grief journey to maybe have as inspiration?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Levi. I think earlier I had alluded to that we're holistic and multidimensional. We all have different needs to take care of in our bodies. For some, it's going to be our mind in this season. Some it's going to be our heart. And so for some people, they can't wait to get their hands on a book or listen to a podcast. For other people, they just need to sing or go to church and sing their heart out. Or it's going to be scripture and having that journaling time that's going to be very helpful for them. And so rather than prescribing any one thing, I think each of us in different seasons are going to need something different to get us through. I've been with patients who there were a few who they just wanted the adult coloring books. They just wanted to draw with their hands. And so we got a few of those. And then as they're drawing, they were able to have their hands focus on this drawing and then start processing out loud what they were going through, just because they were able to kind of engage their entire body.
That's actually beautiful, yeah.
Yeah, there are a few patients who wanted to build something, and so we got some of those like wooden airplanes or wooden car models, and they just put those together. So everybody's going to have their different.
You also had the one who wanted to eat the hamburgers, right? After his wife died, he just needed a hamburger.
As his wife was dying.
Was dying. That's right.
Yeah, so I don't think I tell this story in the book. I may have told it online, and again, details altered, but this guy was yelling in the hallway. I mean, just yelling these violent obscenities. And, this is going to be kind of a side brag, but me being, I guess, retired 6th-degree black belt.
I was going to say, you're the wrong guy to mess with. You got 6th-degree black belt in Taekwondo or Judo?
In Taekwondo.
That's right.
So, and then I did some other like Hapkido and Jiu-Jitsu and boxing and things like that, and some weapons training. But I am actually.
So your hands are. You have to have concealed carry permits to even have your hands on you.
I guess so.
Yeah.
I know that my dad does. He's a 9th-degree black belt.
Jeez.
Yeah. So and the head of security is a guy I used to train with actually. But I saw this guy yelling in the hallway, and I don't recommend this for any healthcare provider, but I felt okay just going up to him. So I got about like this close, real close to maybe 8 inches away or so. And what I said was, "Hey, what do you need right now? What is it that I can get you?" And he kind of just paused. It's almost like he just like instantly snapped out of it. And he started to process about why he was so mad, why he was yelling. And turns out, I guess he had served some jail time before. And he felt like he said that he was like in prison, and the meals were brought to him on a certain schedule. And like he expected to stay there a day, and he had been there now a week. And he said it wasn't even that the food was bad. It's just the fact that it was being brought to him that way. Like he didn't have autonomy anymore,
Gotcha.
And I said, well, what can I do for you? And he said, I just really want a hamburger. And I said, would it be okay if I got a hamburger for you? And he said, yeah, that'll be okay. And I said, do you have any dietary restrictions, like NPO, anything like that? And he goes, no, I'm opposite of dietary restrictions. I can eat all of it. So I went to the nurse, said, is he able to eat? Is he about to have surgery or anything? And she said, no dietary restrictions. And then she looked at me and was like, you get hamburgers for the whole floor? So because I went and got a couple of hamburgers, some fries for the guy. And after that, he was fine. And that was a way of, I guess, de-escalation and meeting him where he needed. But really, was it about the hamburger, or was it about somebody hearing where he was and understanding the reason behind his outburst? And so the next day, I got specifically called to a patient's room on my next shift. And I went there and I was like, I'm not normally specifically called like by name, They asked for I guess the Asian chaplain. So I went over.
Don't they call you chap? That's what you call them?
Yeah. I get called chap quite a lot. And this guy, he says, hey, you the chaplain who gets us hamburgers? So word had gotten around, I guess, that I'm the hamburger guy.
Stop it. And this guy's wife was literally about to die, but he just needed a hamburger and some fries.
We need different things, He needed a hamburger and fries. We may need to go outside in nature. There's some people that don't want to go outside at all. There's some people that just need to watch a good movie. Some people love journaling. Some can't stand to see a blank page and hold a pen, So there are different stages and phases about what we need. I'm in a phase right now where when I drive home from work, and it's a long drive that I have, I usually go in silence. I just don't want the music or a podcast on or an audiobook. I used to just have music blasting, or I'd have an audiobook or something, but sometimes silence and just the sound of the road. And so I'd say what you need right now is the thing that your body needs. And I think there's some people who shame themselves, like, oh, music used to excite me and it doesn't anymore, or something wrong with me, or I'm not getting as excited in church as I used to. But I would say maybe switch it up and find that your body may need something different than what it normally does. Maybe at church, it's going to be the fellowship and food with other people. It's going to be the small group. It's going to be tuning into the pastor's sermon because our mind needs some nurturing,
Yeah.
So there are going to be different things all the time. And I think I'm in a season now where stillness is my friend.
Yes.
I just need the quiet. I've asked my wife, because now we got almost a 4-year-old and a 10-week-old. Sometimes I'm like, hey, can I just have 5 minutes in the room? I'm just going to close the door. And normally, of course, I love being with my family, but sometimes it just starts to feel so overstimulated,
Mm-hmm.
Like, I really just need 5 minutes and
That's
then I'll come back out.
Wow.
And that's what I need right now. That's been what's most helpful.
I relate to that. Thank you for all of that. That's so helpful. My car rides are right now kind of an interesting thing because that used to be when I would call my dad. We talked every day, but it was usually on my commute. I would call him or first thing in the morning. And my daughter, who's 18 and is about to go to college, she was so sweet. She's like, hey, I know you used to always call Dad in the car, but you can't anymore. So if you want to, you could call me, which is so generous of her. And I'm like a hot mess, thinking about that because she's about to go to college and she will be on the East Coast time zone, which will be very helpful because right now, most of the times when I would call my dad, she's asleep. Okay. So it wouldn't work now, but luckily 2-hour time zone will help. But every time I've actually called him twice on accident. Like I got in the car and just by default called him, and then I'm like, like hot mess after I realized what I was doing. But I haven't, when I can't call her, I've called her a bunch of times, but other times I'm just like, I haven't found myself thinking in my Rolodex who else to call. I've more just like sat in the stillness and the silence of that. And sometimes there's something very medicating about that in a good way, right?
Yeah.
As opposed to any other way you could medicate or numb. But yeah, and I think the other thing too that's hard, and I think sometimes it's helpful to separate out is both with Lenya and my dad, there wasn't just the loss and the intra-psychic grief. Thank you, June, for new language for us. But there was also the trauma of the actual, for my dad for example, those days were so brutal. His death was so brutal and unexpected because he was supposed to have another year, that when it all came down, and we were told on Good Friday he had days to live, and we were supposed to be checking into an Airbnb that next week in Phoenix, and it was just like, wait a minute. And by the time I got down there, he wasn't speaking anymore. His, bilirubin and enzymes were clouding his perspective, and then of course all the morphine and stuff he wasn't talking. And so the next few days were so horrific watching him die that my nightmares in the coming days weren't just about I don't have a dad anymore on earth, but it was like reliving the horrific death rattle and the, all of the processes of his body shutting down. And so just like being gentle with ourselves on like, it's not just the actual loss that's going to be hard in 10 years or 20 years, but that's a really traumatic thing to watch another human being go through. And you have to almost heal the trauma and then deal with the loss too, because they're both sister ships, right?
Yeah, I would say you're 100% right. I do want to honor first. I'm really sorry that that's how it went down. Loss rarely ever happens on the terms that we want. It's an unfair thing. I see you go, or you see me go, and it's hardly ever ideal. But yeah, I would say almost all loss, if not all loss, involves a certain level of trauma, where things can happen unexpectedly. Things can happen beyond what we would want. We would all hope for a dignified death and a dignified loss, but sometimes the pace at which it moves, it's so fast and it's so beyond our control. And we try to make these little choices in between to try to have some semblance of dignity in it. But I will see, for example, families a patient who their family may live cross country, and they'll take a red eye and try to make it, and they'll miss their loved one dying by like an hour, and those kinds of things. It's like, we wish this could happen, and then it becomes its own trauma, because there are these unfulfilled longings about how we wanted this dignified death. And death in itself, up close, is extremely difficult to see. I think there's something about the Hollywood aesthetic that has sort of tricked us into what death is supposed to look like. Very clean and very easy, and a very model image of a hospital bed and what a patient looks like.
And I'm sure those things do happen here and there, right?
I don't think people talk about the smells and the sounds enough.
Yeah, right.
And what the body does as it's dying, the way that the orifices work and the way that the tubes are arranged and things like that. And you mentioned the death rattle, the agonal breathing. It can be brutal to watch someone gasping their last breaths. And
unable to clear his throat. I think, so hard to watch him be unable to clear his throat.
Yeah.
And I think for your dad, it's like such this picture of strength and masculinity. Yep. And there was tenderness to it, being able to do what he did for me, holding me and tucking him in and those sorts of things, which is like that horrific honor. But yeah, that was really bad to watch all of that and smell all of that and experience all of that. It's just so terrible. Yeah.
I mean, I talk about it briefly in chapter 6 about also violent loss, when there's like injustice that occurs. And I think all those kinds of losses, being at the hospital, it does come with its own kind of trauma that even when we're prepared, it is so brutal to watch, And so there's no real bow tie that I can say around that, except to say that it's not going to look Hollywood, that it is pretty tough. Most of the quite a few of the deathbeds that I've been at, the patient at some point enters a stage where they're no longer awake and alert. And I've heard last words, but not everyone knows that they're going to get to say their last words. It's often the living who say their last words, the dying.
And do you think part of that is just how nowadays there's such every 15 minutes, the morphine and the Dilaudid and all the things that, because in a previous era, you used to hear a lot about last words. Do you think that was partially because there wasn't the medication to keep people comfortable beyond speaking longer?
It could be. I mean, that is a possibility. I don't know. My two thoughts on pain management are, on one hand, you're right in that some of the medication, it's kind of masking certain things that shouldn't be. But then with pain management, I think our lives are lasting so much longer now that I'm for pain management at the end if it's going to make someone comfortable. So there is a balance between, hey, let's offer comfort and care in a way that will reduce suffering. And at the same time, not so much that we're taking away this person's autonomy and capacity, So that's probably a whole other conversation.
No, but that's a real conversation because I think for me, I was, and let me say this, and I haven't ever given a shout out, but we ended up choosing hospice at home. And on Easter Sunday, we moved Dad to his house in an ambulance, and It was beautiful. We all paraded behind the ambulance on the drive home. It was his last drive, alive on Earth, and my daughter drove his Mustang and put the top down and was right behind the ambulance, and we were all like in a convoy, and we drove him home, and it was, we're all weeping and all this, but the hospice ladies were amazing. Every person connected to hospice gave such tender, sweet care and were so wonderful. And because we were at his house, all of the grandkids and everybody could be around in a way that they weren't allowing at the hospital because there was such a limited amount that could be in the room at the time. Yeah. And even though, like I said, I am continuing to get counseling and work through both the loss and the trauma, because I kind of see them as two different things. There was such beauty in all of us being around what normally you're kind of pulled away from. Hospital death can be sheet over the bed and it's kind of gone. And whereas there was waiting for the funeral home, there was being around it in a way that did give kind of sweet, tender moments, and worship and prayers and goodbyes. And I think it probably helped long-term with closure more being around it as much as we were.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when my aunt-in-law died in 2017, I believe, she also went to hospice. And so she died of breast cancer, and she was in hospice for 3 weeks. And there's that up closeness about it. I mean, it was brutal to watch her die. She was in so much pain. And hospice, like you said, they were incredible. They managed her pain the best that they could. But yeah, I think there was a level of trauma. Like the whole family flew in, and we had a pre-funeral service with her. Like while she was
still there.
While she was still there, each of us got to say something to her, and she got to bless each of us. She gave each one of us a hug and gave us a blessing. And I kind of led a service for our family, and my father-in-law as well. We both kind of led it together. And she was making sounds that I wish no human would ever have to make, just because she was in pain, even with the pain management. And I think there was also something about her choice to want to be awake and alert, not so under that she couldn't, talk with us. But I think that's everyone's choice. For me, I wouldn't want to feel anything. I would tell my wife, just go ahead and, manage my pain the best. You have my consent to do that. I think all that to say, these conversations about how we want to die and how we want to be together at the last moments, if we get the opportunity, these end of life decision conversations need to happen, sooner rather than later. I've seen a lot of rooms where the family didn't know what their loved one wanted. So do we keep them on machines and life support? Do we do as many resuscitation attempts as possible? Do we take them to hospice or not? Or should they die in the hospital? Do we take them home? And they didn't know. So those
most
conversations,
people don't have their will and their estate sorted out. Most people have probably not had these kind of conversations, because death is something we just want to pretend's not happening, and then boom, it's there.
Yeah, and in chapter 5, I do touch on that about healthcare surrogate paperwork, the advanced directives, the living will. What would you like if you end up on life support? And then there's power of attorney stuff and finances, and there's so much paperwork that's involved with this. And I think some of it is necessary, because we do need to have those conversations. Like, as you are dying, what would you want? What would give you a most dignified death? And to prepare for that, to have those conversations, about the trauma, about preparing for what the end will look like, about the sounds and the smells. And a lot of it's not pretty. A lot of it's not Hollywood, and it's very hard to make those decisions. But I think the more we can talk about it, and the more that we're able to make those small decisions, there is a dignity that we can wrap ourselves around in it. I had a friend actually that I call, who he asked me, he said, I'm watching my dad die. I don't know how to handle this. I don't know what to do. And, the inevitable was coming. And the only thing I could really tell him, because he really wanted my advice, he said, I know you can be there for me and all that kind of stuff, but I just need advice. I need something practical to hold on to. And what I told him was, are there small decisions that you can make in between the dying? So I had one patient who said, as I die, don't ever let my lips get dry. Keep putting chapstick on my lips. That was like their dying request. Another patient, who said, let my dog see me before I die. Can you get permission to bring my dog to the hospital to say goodbye? I don't want them to be confused when I don't come back home. These little decisions. I said, can you ask your dad what kind of suit would he like to be buried in? What's the last drink or meal that he would want to have? What is the last song that he would like to listen to when he can't be awake and alert anymore? Those kind of conversations need to be had. And I think that can mitigate at least some of the trauma and some of the guilt. I think that can alleviate some of that difficulty as we see our loved one and their last lights go. And that's not a conversation that I see that's had a lot. And part of my role as a chaplain is to facilitate those conversations. Levi, have been kicked out of rooms when I try to bring up advanced directives, because people think if we talk about death, it'll invite it into the room.
It's giving up hope or failure.
Yeah, like I'm not ready for that yet. And I want to respect that. I want to meet that person where they are, but as gently as I can, I do want to bring that up because we don't know when it's coming. Loss rarely comes on our own terms. And so I'm surprised often by my platform having people come, and the level of engagement is way more than I thought it would be. But I think it also alludes to the fact that people are ready to have this conversation and want to.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, J.S. Park, the book is As Long as You Need, and it's subtitled Permission to Grieve. And I am a reader and have been blessed by it. Encourage you to get it. J.S. or June, thank you for coming on and having this conversation with me. I joked with my counselor this morning that I was like, I'm getting 2 therapy sessions for the price of 1 today because I plan to use this conversation for my own evil purposes. So thank you for what I know this, on behalf of our listeners, has meant to them, but also how encouraging and life-giving it's been for me.
Yeah, Levi, thank you. And I want to lift up Linya and your dad, their lives being honored in you. And every loss around the world happening right now, just honoring every voice, honoring every loss. Thank you for your time and for being so open to share. And appreciate you, and I'm here for you anytime.
I appreciate that, man. I slid into your DMs after I read your book, and you were so gracious right away and kind right away. And I look forward to getting to know you better. And thank you for what you do. Every hospital room you step into, what's going on in your family with your new baby, and blessings to you and to your whole crew.
Thank you, Levi. Much love and gentleness to you.
Thank you so much for listening. Be sure to swing by levilusko.com and jennielusko.com to see what's going on in our world.
And make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single episode. And in the meantime, we would love to connect with you on social media.
Jennie and Levi Lusko, out.
Access more